Hi class, welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. Today we'll be building off of the foundation that we created during the first 2 weeks. In the first week we discussed what is biomedical ethics, and we sort of looked at the boundaries of the field. And then on the second week we discussed or explored different ethical theories that could guide decision making, or that does guide decision making in both medical contexts and beyond. We looked at consequentialism and the many different shades of consequentialism that basically look at consequences and say consequences are ethically important, and we need to weigh the ethicalness of a particular action based upon the consequences that it produces. We also looked at deontology and this idea that duty is important, and the idea that individuals are autonomous decision makers, and this is ethically important. People should be able to direct their lives in a self-directed manner, and that should be respected. And today we're going to build off of this discussion by looking at how the specific principles of autonomy, beneficence, or benefiting your patient, non-maleficence, doing no harm, and justice, looking at how benefits and harms are distributed in a society, how they are applied to specific contexts, and how they could potentially come into conflict with one another. So class today will be structured as follows. We'll briefly revisit autonomy. What is autonomy? Why is it important? Just to set the stage. Then we will be looking at the history of paternalism in medicine, and this boils down to a conflict between the principle of beneficence and the principle of autonomy. And depending on which is more heavily weighted, it would provide us with different recommendations when applied to cases. And then I will provide you with another rough and ready rule of thumb that could be applied in various situations. John Stuart Mill, and you'll remember him hopefully from last week, his harm principle, and how for Mill, respect for autonomy is key, building off of Kant here. And in order to do so, we could follow this harm principle, and this will help guide us in such a way so that we choose actions that indeed respect autonomy. And then I will be briefly just pointing you towards 2 case studies, so hopefully we can have an interesting discussion on these cases in the discussion forum. All right, so let's get started. All right, so autonomy. What is autonomy? Well, autonomy is a person's rational capacity for self-governance or self-determination. And as we discussed earlier, Kant and ethicists since the 1800s have recognized or have argued that the ability to choose a future for yourself and to make decisions, to learn from the past, to self-direct your life, this is an ethically important component of what it means to be a human being that we should respect. We need to respect the decisions of others. We need to respect their freedom in choosing the course of action or the course of life that they so desire. And autonomy encapsulates this respect. So in a nutshell, it's a person's ability and right to choose a particular course of action. Now, autonomy can be limited in many ways, and this will illustrate both the physical and the psychological components of autonomy. I'm getting ahead of myself, but it will also illustrate why providing enough information to patients is considered a principle of autonomy. So limitations to autonomy can be twofold. First, there could be physical limitations where you are literally physically restraining a person, and there could be psychological limitations to autonomy. Now, psychological limitations involve not providing patients or other people, spouses, etc., with enough information to make an informed decision. And this is seen as a limitation of autonomy precisely because in order to exercise your right to self-direct your life or to make decisions, You need to have all of the information available in order to make an informed decision. If you're not provided with impertinent information, you're only provided with, say, half of the truth, right? That, oh, you don't need to worry about these particular side effects, etc. Then you're not able to fully exercise your ability, your autonomous ability to make decisions. So you have physical limitations and you have psychological limitations. Now, limitations to autonomy can be justified, as in the case of when you are potentially restraining someone who could be a harm to themselves or others, or it can be unjustified in cases where you are limiting a person's autonomy in a problematic way. So, for example, only providing half the information to sort of nudge a person into accepting one course of action that might not be the best for them, rather than another course of action, that would be seen as an unjustified limitation of their psychological autonomy. Right? So when we think about how autonomy or respect for autonomy is applied in specific contexts, it's important to remember these different ways that autonomy can be limited, and that providing information is key. Now, questions concerning whether or not we should limit autonomy illustrates a clear conflict between two bioethical principles, specifically autonomy and beneficence. In the case of justified limits to autonomy, or limitations to autonomy, oftentimes these are supported by the position someone is arguing that, well, I just wanted, I wanted to do what was best for you. I wanted to ensure your welfare, right? That's all pointing towards this principle of beneficence, right? Yes, I did violate the principle of autonomy. I didn't respect your ability to self-direct your life, but it was for your own good. You see how that is? Autonomy and beneficence coming into conflict. Now, paternalism is the name for typically prioritizing beneficence over an individual's ability to self-direct their lives, right? Paternalism can roughly be understood as the overriding of a person's actions or decision-making for their own good. Now, there are two types of paternalism. One that we typically accept, and as we'll see that even John Stuart Mill argues that is typically acceptable in society, and one that brings up a whole host of ethical issues, although there are ethical issues, of course, with the weaker form as well. So we need to differentiate, define our terms, right, between weak paternalism and strong paternalism. Weak paternalism is something that is very common in households, especially with small children, right? This is paternalism directed at those who cannot act autonomously or have a limited capacity to make decisions. So, for example, I have 6 brothers, all younger, right? And so I did a lot of babysitting growing up, right? And my brothers happened to have a great love for Twinkies, right? But did I allow, say, my brother Eric to eat an entire box of Twinkies for breakfast? No, I limited his capacity to access said Twinkies, and I also curtailed his desire to eat the Twinkies. Like, I removed said Twinkies from said situation, right? He was not pleased, by the way, and I still think he's holding a grudge, all these years later. But in that instance, me thinking that, okay, this is not healthy for my brother. He could get sick. That is a lot of sugar. It's not nutritious. I'm not going to allow this behavior to occur. That is a form of weak paternalism. I was limiting his ability to act in an autonomous way. And in that situation, one could argue that it was justified, right? Writing on the walls is another thing. My other brother, who is a graphic designer now, he used to love to utilize his crayons on the wall. Not the best thing. At least we should not ask my mother about this. So these are examples of weak paternalistic behavior. But then there's strong paternalism. And strong paternalism is the overriding of a person's choices or actions, even though they are autonomous. So you're a fully autonomous and rational human being, and you go to do a behavior, but you're limited, right? And in the case of, say, stopping a person from harming others, right? Let's say this person acts in such a way, walks on campus and wants to push somebody, in that situation, someone else grabbing the other person so that they no longer have the ability to accost another person. That would be seen as a strong paternalistic action. And in that instance, we could talk about how that's justified, right? Because the person was going to harm another person. And John Stuart Mill would argue that the person was violating the harms principle, just to spoiler alert. But in many situations, strong paternalism could also be unjustified, as we will see. So prior to the 1980s, the question concerning whether or not strong paternalism and what's called medical paternalism should be allowed in medical contexts was unsettled. What should we focus on? Should we prioritize autonomy or the decision-making of our patients, or should we prioritize benefiting the patient? How should we cash these out? Right? Which should we focus on, especially in instances where they could clash? Right? In cases, for example, where a patient is refusing care, and we know that providing care would benefit the patient. Do we respect their refusal of care? Because that would be respecting autonomy. Or do we do that which benefits our patient? And beneficence and non-maleficence, as we'll see, comes into conflict in end-of-life planning, as we'll talk about on Friday. Now, prior to the 1980s, there's also a problematic history, though, with prioritizing beneficence over the autonomy of patients. As you can probably guess, this was intimated with the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and the Stanford prison experiment and various others. So in some cases, patients were thought to have no right to decline recommended treatments. So women with dependent children, for example, who wanted to undergo experimental treatments or highly risky treatments were oftentimes barred from doing so, because the argument was that it was too high of a risk and it could impact the children. There were also forced cesarean deliveries where families were not provided with a choice concerning whether or not a cesarean would be acceptable, and so forth and so on. So medical paternalism is, to quote, a set of attitudes and practices in medicine in which a physician determines that a patient's wishes or choices should not be honored. And why was medical paternalism so prevalent? Well, I want to read you this particular quote because I think it captures the reason behind it well, although it was certainly abused, as well as we'll see in the upcoming video. It is almost exclusively undertaken with the intention of benefiting the patient. In the past, paternalism was considered an absolute medical necessity. An absolute medical necessity, right? Boom! As there was little to no public understanding of medical procedures and practices, end quote. So the idea was that because the public did not have a good understanding of medicine and medical practices, that they didn't have the requisite knowledge to be able to act in an autonomous manner. They did not have the ability to make autonomous decisions in this context because medicine is complex and it might be difficult for people to grasp the nuances of procedures, etc. Right? So because of this, the physician was typically seen as a decision maker, a primary decision maker in medical contexts, right? So they were seen as a surrogate decision maker. However, as we'll see, starting with the late 70s into the late 80s, autonomy has become the bedrock principle of biomedical ethics, sort of taking over and ascending a beneficence in many contexts. And Why is this so? Well, I have a brief video just explaining some of the problematic, gross injustices connected with medical paternalism during this time period.
The serene charm of Windfall, North Carolina, a sleepy town where the Perquimans River empties into the Albemarle Sound. But buried in the stillness of this place, it seems time has forgotten a secret shame.
It was sort of a hush-hush type of thing, and the records and files were all hidden away down in the basement, locked under a key.
Until this past summer, when the ugly truth about what happened here and in towns all across North Carolina could be hidden no more.
If there's anyone in this room that's too embarrassed to tell your story, don't be. Tell it. It needs to be told, and you need to tell it all.
There were a lot of stories that shocked those in the room that day. Stories of shame, confusion, grief. But one story, one single story, seemed to rise above the rest.
I didn't want nobody looking at me because everybody knew what happened to me. That's how I felt inside. My heart bleeds every single day. I'm crushed. They cut me open like I was a hog.
Elaine Riddick's story began in Windfall, among the cotton fields that rose up to meet the tiny two-bedroom house she shared with her grandmother, affectionately known as Miss Peaches. When you come back here, is it nostalgic? Is it bittersweet? Does it bring up moments of anger?
All of the above. Sometimes I can come here and I am in, I can look around me and I can find beauty in the ugliness, the ugly things that happened to me.
It was 1967. Elaine's mother was in prison. Her father had abandoned her, and 5 of her siblings were in an orphanage. Every adult she knew had betrayed her, with the exception of one, her grandmother.
She just paid special attention to me. And she loved me. And she just gave me something that I needed. Sorry.
But life was about to get worse for the poor, hungry little girl Miss Peaches tried to protect.
As I was walking home, I took the long road, and the next thing I know, I was drugged and I was attacked.
And you were raped?
And I was raped. And my life was threatened. And that if I ever told anyone, that he was going to kill me.
And you were 13?
I was 13.
That brutal rape resulted in a pregnancy. Nearly 9 months to the day of the assault, she went into labor.
Got to the hospital, and they put me in a room, and that's all I remember. That's all I remember. When I woke up with bandages on my stomach.
Meaning what?
At that time, I didn't know what it meant.
What she didn't know was that the baby boy she gave birth to that day would be her last.
No one told me. I never even knew.
She had been sterilized, targeted by a state board that ordered that this kind of surgery be performed on thousands of North Carolinians from 1929 all the way to 1974. 7,600 men, women, and children, determined by social workers to be feeble-minded or promiscuous, were sterilized, usually without their consent, and it was perfectly legal.
All right. So due to these gross injustices that were performed utilizing medical paternalism as justification for said procedures and for the overriding of patient decision-making, today this trend is reversed. Respect for autonomy is the bedrock principle of biomedical ethics. And I want to say that again, because this will be on your midterm exam. Respect for autonomy is the bedrock principle of biomedical ethics. So beneficence was previously seen as one of the most important biomedical principles. And now, as we see highlighted from Kant to the Nuremberg trials, to the Tuskegee syphilis studies, to the forced sterilization cases, autonomy is seen again and again as something that needs to be respected in medical contexts. And today, autonomy is respected even in situations where patient autonomy is compromised, right? This is why we have advanced directives. This is why we have DNRs, right? So that even when a patient is not able to vocalize or directly express their wishes in some other way, medical professionals have an understanding of what they would desire, right? And this is seen as a way to safeguard communities from potentially unjust behavior and unjust procedures, etc. Now, so how do we respect autonomy, though? We see these different things. We have strong paternalism, we have weak paternalism, we have physical and psychological limitations of autonomy, we have justified and unjustified limitations of autonomy. How do we determine what's a justified versus an unjustified limitation of autonomy? Well, John Stuart Mill is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. He's like, hold my milk, because he didn't drink. But, hold my water, He's like, I have the principle for you, So John Stuart Mill, and you'll remember him from last week, he's one of the developers of utilitarianism, but he was also highly influenced by Kantian theory and by deontology. And he argued that individual freedom is key. It's a key ethical component in the same way that Kant argued, and that it needs to be respected. So we need to respect autonomy, and we need to understand how best to protect this individual freedom. And part of that is being able to determine what's acceptable limitations of individual freedom and what's not acceptable limitations of autonomy or individual choice. So Mill argues that autonomy cannot be violated without reason. Right? So how do we determine the distinctions between justified and unjustified? Well, let's see what Mill argues. And this is a cute little video, I think, that captures the harm principle very well.
In his book On Liberty, John Stuart Mill argues for one simple principle, the harm principle. It amounts to this: the state, my neighbors, and everyone else should let me get on with my life as long as I don't harm anyone in the process. One way of thinking of this is, my freedom to swing my fist ends at the tip of your nose. If I don't have dependents, I should be free to drink myself to an early death, live as an eccentric, or explore alternative lifestyles, as long as no one else is damaged in the process. Paternalism is okay towards children, they need protecting, but never towards adults who are of sound mind. So, let me get on with my experiments of living, and you get on with yours. And even if I'm wrong about the best way to live, it's better to let me make my own mistakes. This individual freedom is the seedbed of genius. It's also the basis of enduring happiness for...
So I think that little video does an excellent job of discussing Mill's harm principle. So John Stuart Mill basically argues that, a weak paternalism is acceptable in many contexts, although we can discuss, problematic applications as well. But for most cases, protecting a person who is not able to fully self-direct their lives, it might be 5, etc., is an important component of being an ethical human being, right? And this draws from care ethics, right? We have certain duties to others based upon our relationship with them. And parent and child, there are ethical duties entailed in that relationship, and part of that is protecting children from harm. But strong paternalism, for most cases, when another person is of sound mind, and they're making decisions, and they're autonomously directing their lives, right? It is not acceptable, according to the harm principle, to limit their autonomy unless they are a harm to themselves or others, right? Well, even in this case, unless they are a harm. Right? So that provides us with a nice rough and ready sort of rule of thumb to apply to a wide range of situations. So what I'd like to ask you is to take these particular principles, this idea of paternalism, and the 4 principles of beneficence, maleficence, autonomy, justice, and the harm principle, and apply them to 2 case studies. And also discuss them throughout the discussion forum. Right? So the first is a case concerning the refusal of care. And in this situation, this is a case that came out of Australia, actually a couple of years ago, made international news. They have a child, and the child is suffering from an easily treatable type of cancer, right? So the medical professionals are like, yes, the doctors are like, yes, we need to provide treatment. And the treatment actually had a high rate of success, right? But that rate of success goes down dramatically based upon the time that you're waiting. The parents, because they did not understand the procedure, and remember the justification for medical paternalism in the beginning of this lecture, right? The justification was that the general populace did not have enough information or understanding of medicine to make an informed decision. So in this context, the parents didn't understand the procedure, so they refused care. So the child went untreated. So here, should the medical professionals have been allowed to override the decisions of the parents, the surrogate decision makers? Because clearly they're arguing from a beneficence position. So what do you think? Should the parents' decision have been upheld, or should the medical professionals' decision to provide care to the child have been supported in the courts? This went to the courts, and there was a decision, but I'm not going to spoil it for you, so I want to know what you guys think. And I'll post this video. And then there is the case of Charlie Gard. And the case of Charlie Gard, say that 3 times fast, was a case that came out of Great Britain about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. Charlie was born with a severe illness that was essentially fatal. And the parents argued that the child should be given experimental treatments, highly expensive experimental treatments. And the physicians refused. So can physicians, or should physicians, be allowed to refuse requests for futile treatments? Or should the parents' request for the treatment have been supported? Again, this case went to the courts, and I'm curious to see which side you support. Do you support the parents of Charlie Gard, or do you support the medical professionals here? They're arguing it's a futile treatment, it's only going to cause more suffering, and it's a waste of resources, right? And you can see all these sort of indicators, different ethical positions that are being actualized in this case. So I'm going to leave you with that, but I am looking forward to the discussion. Take care all.